Good evening, everyone. Good evening. My name is Neek Laux. I'm the Education Coordinator for Grand Staircase-Escalante Partners. We are a nonprofit organization committed to supporting and promoting Grand Staircase-Escalante National Monument and its scientific and cultural resources. We share monument science through educational programs, carry out restoration and monitoring projects, and advocate for land management policies that support the biodiversity of this region. Through the community lecture series, we host events across GSENM adjacent communities, and now due to COVID-19, significantly more online events to help bring science about the monument's landscapes to local residents, visitors, and those joining us from afar. Our topics span geology, paleontology, archaeology, ethnobotany, and more. Tonight, we get to learn about cultural resources on the monument from archaeologist David Sabata. After a lifetime of interest and a decade of work on behalf of cultural and natural heritage, David was inspired by traditional Paiute women of Southwest Utah to return to school at Northern Arizona University in Flagstaff to learn more about the cultural importance of water resources, water sources, and semi-cultivated plants in relation to archaeology. Employed as an archaeologist by the monument for 2 seasons in support of his master's thesis, David conducted extensive ethnographic research and visited approximately half of the springs mapped on the monument, which is quite the undertaking, recording plant diversity and archaeology. Tonight, we'll hear from David about how various data sources confirm the central importance of water sources for past human habitation and subsistence practices, and see how this legacy continues among living cultures today, having implications for water management in this region. Before I turn it over to David, I'm going to do just a quick orientation to how you can ask questions during this webinar. So if you look at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you should see a number of icons: chat, raise hand, Q&A. If you want to ask a question, just click on the Q&A button. You can type in your question, and then anything that's topical related to the lecture, we will have David answer verbally at the end of the lecture. And anything, if you have logistical issues and need to ask a question, go ahead and put it in there, and I will respond to you with a typed response. At the end of the lecture, if you would like to ask your question by speaking, you also have the option of raising your hand. So you just click the raise your hand button, and when that question is up, or when your turn is up in line, then I'll unmute you and you will be able to ask a question of David. So without any more delay, I'm going to turn things over to David.
Great, thank you so much for that introduction, Neek. I hope everyone can hear me well. Yes, thank you all for joining this evening. I'm excited to present what I learned during my 2 seasons at the Grand Staircase with respect to water, nature, and cultural connections at the Grand Staircase-Escalante National Monument. This is a summary primarily of my master's thesis work. Although there are a few other things that didn't quite make it in there that I might share along the way. To just provide a little quick personal introduction of my own background here. This isn't something I got into halfway through an accounting degree during graduate school or something. I've always been interested in indigenous and settler or historical archaeology, museums, and also the natural world. Growing up in Kansas and Colorado, I graduated with a bachelor's degree in archaeology and anthropology from University of Colorado Springs in 2006, and spent the next decade working on archaeological projects in the Intermountain West, I completed over 50 projects before deciding to return to graduate school. And as Nick mentioned, the impetus for my return was largely the result of influence by Paiute women cultural experts while working on a large-scale transmission line project in Southwest Utah in 2013. I was working as an archaeological monitor in support of Paiute women monitors who were experts in their culture. And I was pretty excited to be out there with them. And I am generally excited about archaeology, but after a few weeks and maybe the half-dozenth or so time of running up to these women with an arrowhead in my hand to show them what I'd found, all excited. One of these women, she said to me, "You archaeologists get so excited about these broken rocks. This is our trash." And it was a humbling moment for me, but as I continued to work with those women, they started to share with me that what bothered them about the project wasn't the potential destruction or scattering of what they considered their trash, but it was the destruction of culturally significant plants, such as the pinyon, juniper, three-leaf sumac, and rose, that really bothered them deeply. And I worked with them to try to help avoid some of the oldest of those plants in proximity to that project. But it really got me thinking about what I was doing as a cultural resource manager on the landscape. And it really provoked my curiosity with respect to the cultural significance of plants. They also talked about the central importance of springs in their own cultural heritage. And so, yes, I decided to return to school at a NAU, which I heard was the best school in the Southwest for working with Indigenous peoples in the Southwest, for my master's in 2015 in order to learn more about the traditional relationships of Native American peoples and perspectives about natural resources across the landscape. And I did end up focusing on springs and plants for that. This picture in the slide here is me visiting one of the springs on the Grand Staircase. It's called, yes?
I think your screen is not completely shared just yet. We're just seeing your name.
Okay. Oh, there we go. I hit share screen. Thank you for that. Is that better?
Yeah, as soon as you start the presentation, we'll see it full screen.
Okay, I'm trying to get into it. There we go. Is that working?
We're now getting part of the slide viewed in a square instead of the full screen.
Ooh.
Instead of like the full slide.
Okay. Just part
Okay,
of
now
it.
it's full screen.
Okay.
And then
it's kind of, there's something here that's blocking me a little piece. There we go. Is that it?
Perfect. There we go.
Great. Thank you, Nick. Okay, yeah, so this is just one example of the kinds of springs that I visited on the Grand Staircase. So this is Drip Tank Spring. This is in the bottom of a drainage. The water comes, can you see my mouse by chance? Okay, so the water comes down through here, it pours off this ledge, kind of carves this out, creates a bowl down here, and then heads on out, and this bowl traps water for weeks. Actually, it's probably a perennial source of water down here. So this is kind of the pattern of my my slideshow here is text over these different glimpses of the environment at Grand Staircase. Am I still with you?
Yes.
Okay, great, thank you. All right, moving on. Quick abstract or overview with respect to this project. So in this country, we have a long history protecting important natural and cultural places. Goes back more than a century, goes back before the Antiquities Act of 1906 and other laws which were used to protect places as diverse as the Grand Canyon to the Grand Staircase-Escalante National Monument. And archaeologists, we're the ones on the ground who are tasked with accounting for the cultural significance of places across the landscape. But we do this by identifying material culture on the landscape. And the purpose of this thesis is to draw attention to other aspects of significance, not just archaeology, but those of traditional Native Americans, with a focus on water sources, plants, and their relationship to archaeology. And the goal of this is, I hope, to help better respect and protect important places across the landscape. As such, I'll share a bit about the background of the Grand Staircase, the natural and cultural setting, the theoretical orientation of my study, my methods, results, and discuss some of the implications and conclusions. The Grand Staircase was founded with a unique mission to protect and study natural and cultural environment of the area and to better understand the cultural and natural history of the region. The motto of the staircase was learning from the land. It was the first national monument managed by the Bureau of Land Management, and the management plan focused on understanding resources in order to improve management, to go about restoration, and to inform the public understanding of these resources. Towards that end, travel and use was restricted, and the land was withdrawn from extractive consideration by major industries. Unfortunately, recent lobbying led to proposed reduction of the monument by about half of its 2 million acres, which has been fought in court, but is apparently moving forward on the ground. To give you a little background that I think is relevant to this study with respect to the natural setting, the staircase is situated on the western end of the Colorado Plateau in south central Utah. It was about 2 million acres when created and surrounded by other protected areas, which combined to help create one of the darkest, quietest, most natural regions left in the 48 states. It's comprised of 3 physiographic provinces. The Grand Staircase, from which it gets its name, is a series of cliffs of sedimentary strata that are between 250 million years old to 2 million years old and range in elevation from 5,000 to 8,000 feet. There's also the Kaparowitz Plateau, which extends from the central to the southeastern portion of the monument, and Escalante Canyons in the northeastern portion of the monument. Relevant to this study is the hydrology of the area. Surface water is extremely scarce. It's estimated by some to be less than 1/1000th of the landscape surface. Most of the water on the monument is trapped in aquifers, but expressed as springs. And these average about a half-day walk apart, say perhaps 10 miles or so. The area gets between 6 to 20 inches of water a year, depending on the climate zone, which is largely dependent on elevation. Potholes in the sandstone might keep water for days or weeks after a precipitation event. The middle elevations are best suited for farming based on this precipitation pattern, frost, and other considerations. The monument is home to more than 90% of Utah's known biodiversity. Over 1,200 species of plants have been recorded across the monument. Much of this biodiversity is concentrated around springs. There are relic environments across the region of the staircase that are home to a wide variety of animals: elk, deer, bighorn, antelope, mountain lion, bear, beaver, rabbit, as well as birds: turkey, hawk, eagle. One study of bees revealed over 600 species. So there's no really good measure of the animal biodiversity on the monument yet. And few ecological studies have been conducted on the monument. In terms of the cultural setting, there's over 11,500 years of human history that's been recorded thanks to important work by the University of Utah, which was done in an alcove in sort of the central northern portion of the monument area, not exactly on the monument, but just adjacent to it. There they discovered evidence of cultivation of the little wild potato, an imported cultivar from South America, actually. There's lots of evidence, Paleo-Indian, archaic hunting, gathering, and other groups in the area, including the Paiute, who were the most numerous folks when European colonizers arrived. The Paiute lived part of the year in semi-permanent settlements near springs that were based largely on kinship relationships to those places. These are places that they return to at some point during their seasonal rounds. Seasonal rounds is a term used to describe the process by which these folks moved around the landscape throughout the course of the year in order to gather and hunt at ideal times in certain places. But they would return to these springs, and according to Isabel Kelly's ethnographic work in the early 30s, springs were as close to owning anything as these people came. A Paiute greeting was, "Where is your water?" And springs often had these kinship relationships kind of formed around them, where you might live at one spring and your family, your next nearest family might live at the adjacent spring, and so on and so forth. They also semi-cultivated a variety of plants near water sources. Jacob Hamblin, a Mormon colonist, encountered fields of Paiute corn growing in Johnson Canyon when he first came to the area. They were known to have planted, transplanted, and semi-cultivated a wide variety of plants. They continued gathering on the Grand Staircase until a short time after its establishment, at which time there was some confusion about whether or not gathering was allowed. But they maintain ancestral connections to the monument through pilgrimage, migration routes, during which they make visitations to springs and offerings at springs on the way to one of their traditional cultural places, a holy mountain that's situated on the monument. There were also various Puebloan groups that have long traditional relationship with the monument, including the Hopi, the Zuni, and the Tewa, of potential Fremont cultural affiliation. Traditional Hopi continue to visit the staircase for ceremonial reasons, to gather cottonwood root, also used in ceremonial crafts, to hunt and make offerings at springs, and to visit other traditional cultural places. Hopi cultural experts have expressed the desire to continue to be involved in the monument. And Navajo have also used portions of the monument traditionally, especially on the eastern and southern portion of the monument, for grazing, the gathering of plants. The gathering of pinyon nuts had gone on for generations on the North Kaibab Plateau until the monument was created, after which that was disallowed. But use of the monument has continued by way of the Navajo Native American Church groups. They still collect sage, oak, other plants. And then European and American arrivals to the area. The Dominguez-Escalante expedition came through the area in the late 1700s. They knew how to identify springs by the presence of cottonwoods that contrasted sharply against the red rock and other sandstone features of that landscape. And later, the Powell expedition came to the area in the 1870s. And when Powell first came down the Colorado River, he saw relic gardens irrigated by springs adjacent to ancient dwellings in the vicinity of Glen Canyon, which is on the eastern border of this staircase. He was among the early visitors to the Paiute, who led him from spring settlement to spring settlement as he explored the area. Mormon settlers also reached the staircase a little bit prior to Powell and continued to pour in afterward. They prioritized the colonization of springs, water sources, and with them they appropriated the associated gardens of Paiute peoples while they were out on their seasonal rounds. So they'd return from their seasonal rounds and discover that other folks were living at those springs now and told them to go farm the desert. They took over Pipe Springs, Moccasin Springs near Kanab. The temple in St. George is built on top of a sacred Paiute spring. Ranchers took springs for use of watering their stock. And it's no coincidence that within 30 years, over 90% of the Paiute population in Utah had died. In terms of the theory that's motivated and guided this study, I mentioned earlier my personal reevaluation of the theoretical orientation of my discipline, cultural resource management, inspired by Paiute elder women who cared more about the destruction of culturally significant plants than the potential scattering of what they called their trash. This is situated within the body of theory known as anthropology, which is a study of humans. And cultural resource management is led by archaeologists who are anthropologists, but they focus on material culture. So the artifacts, features, and architectural remnants of past peoples. Because of this configuration of responsibility, the cultural significance of places without archaeology is often overlooked. This can lead to negative results surveys for cultural significance across landscapes. It often leads to adverse impacts to traditional resources not considered as a result of this bias toward material culture. Ecological anthropology is the study of the interaction between humans and the environment. Ethnographic work is key to understanding these relationships. I mentioned briefly the work of Kelly done in the early 30s. She was an ethnographer working with Paiute peoples who could remember life the way it was when the Mormons began to come into the area and just prior to that. The work of Richard Stoffel was also very influential in informing my ecological, anthropological understanding of Paiute traditional values with respect to plants. He also developed a qualitative/quantitative method for assessing site significance based on plants through work that he did closely with traditional Native American communities that value those areas. In absence of the opportunity to work closely with Native Americans, I found ethnographic literature invaluable, and it's what I relied upon to do this study. Richard Yarnell he did a study in the 1950s called Distinctive Flora on Puebloan Ruins. He wouldn't have considered himself an ecological anthropologist, but he used ethnographic data on the relationship between Native Americans and plants of importance to survey Puebloan sites at Bandelier National Monument, and he looked for species that occurred on or near archaeological sites that were not found elsewhere. And he found over 20 important species associated with Puebloan archaeological sites. And noticed that the potato family, the Solanaceae, are especially correlated to archaeology and important. Traditional cultural place theory, it was developed by Tom King and Patricia Parker, released Bulletin 38 to help guide cultural resource managers to consider places valued by traditional communities on their own terms. And this was in response to cultural resource surveys that were turning out basically findings of negative results about areas that were indeed very highly culturally significant but lacked archaeological expression. Thus, I think this is a great place to talk about, this is a great theory, a body of ideas to talk about the cultural significance of natural places or resources. As Sutton and Anderson noted in Cultural Ecology, many traditional societies do not hold the view that people are separate from nature. This is very much an inherited paradigm of the Western intellectual tradition in which we find ourselves immersed. TCP theory can be applied anthropologically. It requires ethnographic investigation, and federally funded and permitted actions are technically required to consider TCP potential, but I've found that it rarely occurs, and we usually don't discover information about a TCP until a community responds to the proposed destruction or the active destruction of a sacred site, and it's often too late at that point. Therefore, traditional cultural place theory can help us to better respect and protect places of traditional importance to living communities today. So I used these anthropological sources, ethnographic sources, historical sources, and input from Native American stakeholders to build my understanding of the cultural significance of natural resources on the monument. Early Southwestern explorers such as archaeologist Walter Hoff noted early on that wherever there is a spring or running water, there is a place to look for ruins, meaning archaeological sites. The cultural significance of springs would seem pretty apparent, you know, just intrinsically, instinctively, if you've ever hiked in the desert and been terribly thirsty and relied upon springs for your drinking water, you might have come to value springs, or perhaps just the coolness that they offer, or the shade of the plants that are found near springs. They're critical for all life. 90-something% of the biodiversity in these regions depend on springs for water. They're so important that they were passed down, as we mentioned earlier. They support the greatest concentrations of biodiversity across the regions. And humans have enriched this biodiversity over time. The ethnographic record has many instances. I came across many instances talking about how different cultural groups of this region would plant, you know, things that were favorable to humans and animals in vicinity of springs, so that those things would be there when they returned later for their use. Archaeologist McFadden of the monument postulated that spring-fed riparian areas favored cultivation, and obviously they're critical to wild and domestic animals, and as such they make great places to ambush game, which many cultures have done over time. And these springs are still visited by Native Americans in the region for water, hunting, and ceremonial purposes. With respect to the cultural significance of plants, through my literature review, I learned that plants are considered traditionally among the Paiute people to be living beings imbued with power that had to be approached and treated with respect in order for those plants to be of service in the ways that were needed to human beings. There are thousands of uses documented for hundreds of species across the monument. There's over 11,000 year history of imported cultivars, as we talked about. And they were also important to settlers in terms of grazing, food, fuel. The Paiute taught early Mormon settlers about edible plants and are credited with saving many of their lives at a time when they were faced with starvation in the region. And thus, the sago lily, which is an edible bulb, became the state flower of Utah. Traditional gathering of plants is ongoing, largely ceremonial on the monument. but was stifled as a result of confusion and the policies of the monument, as well as, other historical circumstances there. Today, traditional gatherings conducted mostly without official knowledge. The cultural significance of animals at the monument: they're often hunted for meats, hides, tools, ceremony. A Hopi elder told me that they make offerings at springs, not just in thanks for the water that gives the hunter life, but for the animal that would be hunted at that spring. On to my methods here. I relied on archaeological sampling, springs and plant sampling to build an understanding of the cultural significance of individual springs. In terms of archaeological sampling, I reviewed existing records of sites previously found near springs. It's important to know that not much of the monument's been surveyed. I think less than 20% of the monument, maybe something closer to 10%, but there still is a lot of information there. I also recorded archaeology sites that I found at springs when I went to visit them. And I just looked for any archaeology, in places that looked favorable to hanging out near springs. So it's called a reconnaissance survey method. It's not as intensive as some of the surveys we do, but I've never found more archaeology with less work in my life than in this manner near springs. Often those sites were in an alcove or at a place protected from the elements by a rock wall face or some other favorable feature. In terms of springs and plant sampling, I visited about half the named and mapped springs on the monument, about 75 of the 150 or so. I visited springs that were recommended to me because they were awesome and had great archaeology. I visited springs just picked from a map. I visited springs close to where I was stationed and as far as I could get from where I was stationed. So several hours drive from Kanab. I recorded plants near springs and near archaeology I found in close association to springs. And this slide here serves as a useful example of my approach in this respect. I hope you can see my cursor here. So we're within an alcove. You can see the ceiling here. You can't quite see the floor down here, which was an archaeological site that I saw when I drove to check out this spring over here. And you can just barely see the bright green tops of these cottonwood trees, the only cottonwood trees you can see in this picture, which is mostly dominated by pinyon and juniper shrubland. But what else do you see? There's a bush here right outside the alcove in what we call the midden or trash area, which is a serviceberry. It's one of the few serviceberry that are only in this area kind of in front of the alcove here. So serviceberry is a berry producing shrub that was valued by Paiute, Puebloan people all over the region. And there's other plants right outside here you can't really see too well, like the wide leaf yucca, also called the banana yucca. It's fairly scarce in the area, but you're much more likely to run into it near an alcove or near an archaeological site than anywhere else out here on the landscape. And these things, they might hang out a little bit outside here, and within the alcove itself, in the mortar of storage features used to hide, harvested corn and stuff, I found the leaves of dried cottonwood trees. The nearest cottonwood are over there. These might be the only cottonwood in 10 miles, any direction. Remember, that's about how far springs are on the monument. So this is one example of how I went about this. So I would record the plants here at the spring. I would record all the plants all the way up to the alcove here in between. And I counted all those toward this landscape level site significance for that spring right there. In terms of my plants recording, I tried to record every plant I saw, as I said, between the spring and the archaeology. I took pictures, voucher specimens, etc. I would go back to the field office and consult with BLM botanists to identify those plants. I would look then for, uses in ethnobotanies, other sources, and I would collate those uses. In addition to recording plants, I recorded invasive species. Yep, other plants, like here, there's Russian olive down below here. It's not from here, it's moving in. I recorded erosion, the presence and absence, condition of fencing, whether it was developed historically for stock, most of those things. And applied anthropology. This is a mixed methods approach. I used qualitative and quantitative data to inform this study, which was driven by the theory that I mentioned earlier, informed by previous research, in order to develop a tool for assessing site significance, based largely on plants, using sort of a simplified approach based on the work of Stoffels, in which I counted edible, medicinal, craft, ceremonial, and other uses and aspects of significance. I compiled these into a plant's use index, which I used to code for the significance of springs. So a quantification of otherwise qualitative data in order to analyze that data for patterns by way of exploratory data analysis. So again, the goal here was to identify places of elevated importance by way of archaeology, plants, and the application of this anthropological data. I reviewed all the literature I could get my hands on with respect to the Native American settlement and subsistence of springs and uses of plants. In order to create that plants use index, I ended up collating over 1,000 uses, coded for over 70 something genera at 100, encompassing over 100 species, and used these to assess spring site significance. And I also considered, the preponderance of archaeology in an area to also, be an expression of the significance of that spring site. Kelly talked about how sometimes people, they wouldn't necessarily settle in the same place over and over again. They might settle near the same spring over and over again, but for various reasons, they would move their small villages around a spring sometimes. So I compared spring site significance to a sample of upland assessment, inventory, and monitoring, or AIM sites recorded by professional botanists previously. These are done for rangeland health studies, but they're almost never in vicinity of a spring or in a proper riparian habitat, even though springs and water sources are those places most heavily frequented by cattle. Unfortunately, later, I picked those AIM sites, the sample randomly. Unfortunately, later, I found out that some of those were less than a mile from water, which makes them not ideal for this sample, kind of biases them against me, but that's okay. And I looked for archaeological sites within a 1 mile radius of springs counted based on existing records and the new sites I found. So on the results here. So this is the results of spring site significance based on the number of uses at 2 seasons of, after 2 seasons work. So about 75 springs here. Just a moment. So if you look at this, yeah, where are we at here? Okay, so I just lost my place, excuse me. Okay, so over 2 seasons, I recorded over 70 genera at over 70 springs. These uses range from 137 to 982 uses here, an average of about 540 uses. And I found about 8.2 archaeological sites within a 1 mile radius on average. If we move on to the AIM data, the results of my sample of AIM sites, which I used as my control group to compare to springs, they ranged from about 177 to about 542 uses, with an average of about 400 uses per AIM site. And they were associated with about 5 archaeological sites, 5.3 within a 1 mile radius. As I mentioned, this sample was not ideal because some of these places were closer than a mile to water. I figured out later. When we look at a combination of both those data in relationship to archaeology, you can see here that there's a slight positive covariation of springs towards culturally significant biodiversity and archaeology. They're trending in this upward direction here. Here's the high end of our counts in terms of archaeology sites and spring sites. And you can see that the springs are generally speaking more culturally significant in terms of their biodiversity and their archaeology, the name sites, although there's a couple outliers here. I'd like to visit that spot. I think a better group, a better aim sample would probably increase this disparity. A larger study would probably as well. But this is, this is just one way of looking at these data, and things are a lot more complex and there's a lot more variation in real life that is important to consider. So I wanted to provide one notable example here. So while my exploratory data analysis suggests that there's more culturally significant biodiversity and more archaeology near springs than random upland locations, perhaps not very well chosen, this is an important example of the other end of that. So this is a really great spring in terms of its hydrological functioning. Puts out a lot of water. You can drink from it readily. You could fill your water bottle up in just a few seconds with the spring that comes out of a pipe that was put into this back in here. I wonder if I can, oh, that's not what I was trying to do. It's back here a little ways. But there's not a terribly high biodiversity value for this spring. It's kind of average. And there's not a high archaeological value for this spring. It's actually has few archaeological sites in relative vicinity of this spring. But the one site I did find near this spring on my way to it, which was not previously recorded, was a very significant archaeological site. It's a south-facing alcove. I believe it's the site for which this spring is actually named. It's about 150 meters to the east of this spring here, so it's not within spitting distance at all, but it's a short walk. Culturally, in terms of cultural resource management, we usually consider anything more than 20 or so meters away from something as a distinct thing. So an average archaeologist, if they came across that site, they would not record this spring as a feature of that site. But I think the association and the depth of deposits make it obvious that this spring made that alcove an exceptionally nice place to hang out. In that alcove, I found 800-year-old or so ancestral Hopi yellowware. It's yellow because it was fired with coal, which they started using around that time to fire pottery. It's very distinctive. And I also found a Hopi migration symbol in that alcove. I later met a Hopi elder who conveyed to me that his grandfather of the Water Clan had taken him to this spring as a young man. He continues to collect cottonwood material in that area for ceremonial purposes, and he made this modern offering for that spring in order to let them know that we're still here. So this is a really great example of a spring that has an average biodiversity, a low archaeological site count, but is of continuing cultural significance to traditional peoples. And in that respect, this very much qualifies as a traditional cultural place in terms of what we were talking about earlier, but it's not officially recognized. It's still cared for by the Hopi, but this is in an area that was cut by the Trump administration. They said, because there's nothing significant in that area. Ignorance is not, confirmation of bias. So this is a good example. The most common spring type that I encountered in a drainage bottom, water would come over the top here, pour down this side, scour out this alcove and exit, but continues to come out here over time. let's see here. So I was going to mention also that some of the most important species culturally are not found at springs. I never found an association with springs, but at uplands, like tobacco. You'll be hard pressed to find a tobacco plant near a spring, but you can find tobacco. And in fact, the only tobacco I found on the entire monument was near an archaeological site, one of the most important archaeological sites on the monument, which is at a confluence of rivers up which both rivers have an abundance of small springs. But none of those springs individually harbors a very high biodiversity value in and of themselves, but they each harbor something a little bit different. So at one spring, there might be a chokecherry, and at another one, box elder, and at another one, rose, really specifically. Actually, that spring that I'm referring to with the rose, that spring was called Rosewater by the Paiute, according to Isabel Kelly's field notes. And I went out there. She never got to go there. I went out there and there's still rose growing 150 years after the last people could remember it growing there. And Paiute people are known for having planted rose and talk about planting rose near their habitations. So that's another example wherein individually those springs may not yield particularly high biodiversity values or use values in this case, and may not be associated with a ton of archaeology individually, although actually the springs in that area are associated with very high archaeological values. But together as a landscape, that area is one of the most culturally significant places on the monument that just barely escaped being cut from the revised monument boundaries, and important areas just south of that area were cut from the monument. I wish I could show you all maps of this kind of stuff. Unfortunately, because of the sensitivity of these data, I'm inclined not to give away specific locations of these resources, but I hope this gives you a picture of what's at stake in this area. So in summary, I set out to kind of show, how to explore the cultural significance of springs, and found that springs were absolutely central to patterned human activity. And this is revealed through the archaeology, of which there was about 50% more on average than upland places, randomly chosen, more or less, and more culturally significant biodiversity. But some springs have a heck of a lot more of both of these things than others. And if we were to protect places across the landscape, those might be really great places to start. For instance, I encountered sites that had as much as 2.5 times the culturally significant biodiversity than the average, and up to 4 times the archaeology as seen in the AIM sites on average. And usually those things were together, so very often they were. So even though associated archaeology maybe, I'm suggesting here demonstrates the significance of springs, it's, as an archaeologist, the most excited we get about any of this stuff is the archaeology, and that's what we would focus on recording. But it's the springs themselves that are the primary nuclei of patterned human activity. And in cultural resource management, we define a cultural site as a nucleus of human activity, and springs are like meta nuclei. It's like the next order up here, and associated biodiversity. And those water sources and that biodiversity, I'd argue, are the foremost factors of cultural significance that attracted the archaeology that we value as archaeologists. As I mentioned, the number of sites is not always a good indication of the cultural significance of a spring. It might be the longevity and intensity of the occupation at a single site, such as the one I just showed as an example, rather than the number of sites. So these are just important things to consider that depart somewhat from my hypothesis here. In terms of threats to springs that I became aware of out there, and just as I thought about things, in terms of what we do, we consider the effects of proposed projects on landscape surfaces, but we do not consider the effects of those projects to aquifers. I think this is a major deficiency in terms of what we do as cultural resource managers, and also in terms of environmental management. Wells for ranching and agriculture take most from aquifers. They replace rich biodiversity with monocultures of invasive species. In many cases, I saw this over and over again throughout the monument, where water had been diverted from biologically rich areas to water a tank out in the desert, and after the failure of that tank, all that's left is a tamarisk. And those biologically rich areas don't come back very easily. Most of the major springs have been adversely impacted by development for purposes of stock on the monument. And hydrology of these springs is not measured well enough to track change, like impacts from these projects. Unfortunately, only qualitative assessments of springs have been done on the monument. And even so, the majority of those have assessed over time that springs are in declining hydrological functioning and biodiversity condition. We've had warming and drying trends now for the last half century. These are exacerbated by efforts to extract more water from these aquifers. So I recommended the Spring Stewardship Institute approach, which is a qualitative and quantitative measure of springs. And that was being considered by professionals at the monument when I departed. So hopefully they're starting to implement that protocol now. There's no sustainable rate of extraction of water in the semi-arid West. Extractive industries led the lobbying effort to reduce the monument. Those were coal, oil, and gas. They all use water for extraction. And in addition to illustrating the importance of springs, I think this study demonstrates the importance of uplands also. An average of 400 uses at random upland locations is nothing to sneeze at, right? No cultural resource management survey should ever return negative results for cultural resources just because there isn't archaeology. I think we should widen our gaze beyond archaeology to better account for the cultural significance of places, or else what are we doing out here? Unfortunately, only a very small percentage of the places that we as archaeologists record and recommend for protection ever actually get formal recognition of that protection. I mean, it's really, really small. It's something like 0.0001% or something like that. But if we're doing this, couldn't we at least, protect 10% of places? And if we were allowed to protect 10% of landscapes, we could protect 90% of the biodiversity and a great deal of the archaeology by protecting springs, drawing circles around those places. With that, I think I'll close. I'd like to acknowledge my NAU thesis committee, Drs. Downham, Thompson, and Hardy, my former archaeologist supervisor, Matt Zweifel, at the Staircase, former manager Carolyn Shelton, the botanists on which I relied in so many instances to help ID plants. As I said, I'm an archaeologist, not a botanist. I learned a lot of plants out there, but these folks were invaluable. There are a lot of highly skilled, dedicated professionals working for Utah BLM. A lot of them gave me assistance, and I'm thankful for all of them. Other friends and family, as well as Respect and Protect campaign, which I'd like to share with you all, just some valuable references here as we take questions.
All right, thank you so much, David, for that window into all of the work that you've done around springs and culturally significant plants. So we're going to open it up to questions. If you have any, go ahead and drop them in the Q&A. Our first question from Sarah is, based on the knowledge and insights you gained through your work, how can we incorporate indigenous knowledge into land management policies?
Yeah, that's a great question, Sarah. And I think the traditional cultural place approach, which is detailed in Bulletin 38, Google that was put together by Patricia Parker to guide cultural resource managers such as myself in working toward the identification of traditional cultural places with the groups that value these places most. And so whereas I relied upon ethnography to inform you know, sort of my understanding of these patterns, that really encourages folks to engage with the living communities that still value these places. And that's really the best way to go about this. Richard Stoffel, his large body of work also, he worked with a lot of different Native American groups, soliciting their feedback with respect to the cultural significance of plants and a number of other natural features across the landscape. So as archaeologists, it can be you know, a little bit difficult to find this leverage, but it's actually required by law. You know, I was reading the BLM handbook for archaeological resources here in Colorado recently, because I am employed currently as an archaeologist for BLM Colorado, but I forgot to mention that I am here in a non-official capacity. That's very important to mention from time to time, just as a researcher. And it did recommend that, you know, places be considered for TCP potential prior to going through with proposed activities. Like I mentioned, I don't see that happening very often, unfortunately, in practice, and we usually don't hear about TCPs, as they're called, until they're just getting ready to be destroyed, and then somebody, a traditional Native person, steps forward and usually protests that destruction. So, but that's not always enough to save those places. So that's why the TCP tool was developed. There's another bulletin that actually has to do with landscape archaeology that I think was authored by Stoffel. I can't remember the number of that bulletin, but that's another way to go about documenting the cultural significance of natural features across the landscape. So I encourage you to look up both of these researchers and the bodies of work that they have developed to help inform what you might do in that respect. Thank you. I've lost audio.
No, sorry, I was talking and I was muted. It
Oh, no,
happens
that's
to
fine.
all of us, including me. Thank you for that answer. So another question we had come in is around whether invasive species like Russian olive and tamarisk or other invasive species are found in these TCP sites, or I guess that's a TCPs, and
Sure,
if
spring
so,
sites,
if
yeah.
there are any efforts
Mm-hmm.
to eradicate and control them.
Yeah, that's a great question. That's one of the things that I recorded, was the presence or absence of invasives. I got to tell you, unfortunately, they're usually there. There's usually invasives there. I was especially pleased when I found springs that didn't have invasives. It's a lot less likely than the other way around, unfortunately. Because of the isolation of springs, some of these springs, they maintain a relict environment in their proximity that is great. It's a protecting feature for those springs. So even though the most springs are found in the bottom of drainages, and drainages act like a highway for those invasive species to kind of race up, right? Like the Escalante drainage connects to the Colorado River, and the Colorado River got these, you know, tamarisk and whatnot, and they raced up the Escalante. And yes, there's been a really huge and awesome effort by the Escalante River Watershed Partnership project, I think, is what those invasive species along 100 miles of that corridor from near the town of Escalante to the Colorado River. I think they've just finished up some of the final legs of that, and now they're working on maintaining that stretch. And that was through the help of some really generous donors like the Walton Family Foundation, I think, and folks, and the work of a ton of awesome young environmental professionals through a number of different organizations. But those efforts have concentrated on the information for restoration. And there have been efforts to protect springs on the monument in the past through the building of exclosures to keep out cattle that sometimes go a little hard on springs in terms of their vegetation and often reduce biodiversity in the vicinity of those locations. Unfortunately, those efforts have not been maintained. Most of those exclosures have been breached over time, and efforts that we made with Grand Canyon Trust and Great Old Broads for Wilderness to try to propose some springs restoration on the monument were unsuccessful. And I believe that was as a result of pushback by ranching folks. So I think we have to do more to reach out to those folks and describe the benefits of springs restoration in terms of what native species offer in terms of restoration. Like willow help to grow the hydrological sponge of springs. They actually help increase the availability and amount of water out of spring over time. So it's no mistake that Puebloan peoples planted willow at springs that didn't have any. This is documented ethnographically by Whiting in his Ethnobotany of the Hopi, ahead of other species to grow that sponge prior to, I think, more intensive use of those springs. So I think it's a great question. I encourage you to look at some of those sources I shared, because you'll find little nuggets of indigenous wisdom that pertains to some of that. And unfortunately, as things warm and dry, we might just be left with some of those invasives. Those might be some of the only trees on some of these landscapes in a few years. They're not entirely without use either. The Russian olive has an edible berry. Doesn't taste like much, but if you added some other tastier stuff to it, I bet Puebloan people would have planted that. The tamarisk is a little more problematic because it leaches salt to the surface, deposits it in its leaves, and nothing native around here can survive, not much anyway, within that leaf matter. I mentioned earlier the most important archaeological site on the southern end of the monument is a 50-room pueblo at a confluence of two drainages. When it was recorded in the early 1990s, they recorded willow as the dominant species in that drainage. Today, there are no willow there. There are only tamarisk. I found no willow in that spring. The only willow that you can find are in the springs that are not connected to the drainage, but are hundreds of meters either direction of it. And those are the places I'd like to see kept free of tamarisk and kept free of Russian olive. If we could protect those little hot spots of biodiversity, it'd go a long way toward, providing the conditions necessary to, for restoration in the future. So. Great question.
Thank you. And then we have one more question that you touched on already, but the question from Max is, any thoughts on impact on GSENM springs from cattle grazing?
Yeah, huge
anything
impacts.
Else you want to add?
Huge impacts, and they're not measured very well at all. So I mentioned earlier, they have a range monitoring program, the assessment inventory monitoring program. They measure upland sites exclusively. I've never seen any of them put in a riparian habitat or a spring habitat. And I think that might be intentional. I don't know, but those places are the most hammered by cattle. They're the places that had the greatest concentrations of biodiversity, and they're some of the least studied places on the monument. So, and cattle have to have water to survive. And that's a rich cultural history out there in terms of, cattle and stock raising. But it's absolutely ultra. Arizona Strip was described as a sea of grasses as high as a horse's belly, as far as you could see. Okay, this is just north of the Grand Canyon from like Kanab to St. George. And in 20 years, it was gone. And those were edible grasses that had been cultivated by native peoples for thousands of years for their edible seed heads, but they cultivated them in ways that helped them reproduce themselves. And that was that was like their fields. And when the Mormons came in, they wiped out in 20 years. I think that's very highly correlated with the unfortunate, cultural and physical genocide of the Paiute people.
Thank you. So it looks like we've worked through all the questions. So I just want to thank you for taking the time to share your expertise with us tonight. And folks who are attending, if you want to return to some of these topics, you will get a link to a recording. So you can go back and think about these topics a little bit more.
Thank you so much, Neat. And I was just going to mention, if anyone has any other questions that weren't addressed, or you have questions on the YouTube video later, feel free to run a little Google search on my name, and you should be able to get my contact information pretty quickly through that. And I'm happy to answer questions or provide resources. Unfortunately, I won't be telling you about the specific location of archaeological sites, but anything else.
Thank you for keeping those protected. All right. Have a good evening, everybody, and thank you.